while others are coming down before we get time to get started, I want to go ahead and depending on how many others come in, I will coming down before we get say it again to them. Get started, or you want to go ahead and I'll sit near you. Depending on how others come in, I will coming down before we get say it again to them. Phyllis Northcutt asked, I want to go ahead and I'll sit near you. Depending on how others come in, coming down before we get say it again to them. Phyllis Northcutt asked, I want to go ahead and I'll sit near you. Depending on how others come in, coming down before we get say it again. But have Phyllis Northcutt asked, I want to go ahead. And I'll depending on how others coming down needs food. But have Phyllis Northcutt want to go ahead and I'll depending on how others Pat is diabetic needs food. Blind have Phyllis Northcutt want to go ahead and I'll depending on how others Pat is diabetic needs food. Blind have Phyllis Northcutt want to go ahead and I'll we are actively looking Pat is diabetic needs food. Blind have Phyllis Northcutt. We are actively looking at is diabetic needs we are actively looking at is diabetic needs we are actively looking at those are helping. We are actively looking at those are helping. We are actively those are helping. We are because they don't have if I felt the same way, because they don't have if I felt the same way, because they don't have what they if I felt the same way, because they don't have what they if I felt the same way, because they don't have what they if I felt the same way, because they don't have because what I don't what they if I felt the same way, because they don't some is what I don't what they if I felt the same way, because they don't some is what I don't what they if I because His word some is what I don't what they if I because His word some is what I don't what they if I because His word some is what I don't what they if I because His word some is what I don't this is the this is the Chapter 8, verse 1, and I know the answer. Chapter 8, verse 1, and I know the answer. Chapter 8, verse 1, and I know the 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 I'm with it. Chapter 8, verse 1, and I know my heart is in it. I'm with it. Chapter 8, which means my heart is in it. I'm with it. It's not chapter 8, which means my heart is in it. I'm with it. It's not chapter 8, which means my heart is in it. I'm with it. It's not chapter 8, which means my heart is in it. I'm with it. It's not chapter 8, which means my heart is in it. I'm with it. It's not chapter 8, which means my heart is in it. I'm with it. It's not chapter 8, which means this is it's fascinating. It's that guy becomes the Well, this is what grace does. Great. Well, this is what grace does. Always does. Great. Well, this is what grace does. Always does. Great. Well, this is what grace does. Always. Great. We're just rejection. Well, this is what grace does. So what? Great. We're just rejection. Well, this is what grace does. So what? Great. We're just rejection. Holy channel. This is what grace does. But there's so what? Great. We're just rejection. Holy channel. This is what grace does. But there's so what? Great. We're just rejection. Holy channel. I should not. This is what grace does. But there's so what? Great. We're just rejection. Holy channel. I should not. This is what grace does. But it's happy. But there's so what? Great. We're just rejection. Holy channel. I should not. This is what grace does. But it's happy. But there's so what? Great. We're just rejection. Holy channel. I should not. This is what grace does. But it's happy. But there's so what? Great. Holy channel. I should not. This is what grace does. But it's happy. But there's so what? Great. So Saul, who's there, going further. At that time, Saul, who's there, going further. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get going further. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this at that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, goes against the church. Once they get so here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, what is that? Goes against the church. Once they get so far, here's this middle verse. At that time, Saul, who's there, what is that? Goes against the there's no wisdom. Now, for awareness, there's no wisdom. Now, for awareness, there's no wisdom. There's no wisdom. What's that? There's no wisdom. What's that? There's no wisdom. Don't get the wrong idea. I'm going to be praying for you, but I got to protect my family. Now, I'm choosing something like that because we all can identify, because that's hard. Or any number of reasons. Remember the reasons Jesus gave in the parable of the great banquet? I bought a field and I need to go see, business. I got a business deal, and if I can't lose it. I just married a wife. She's going to be furious if I go with you. And we understand, right? Well, he just took on a new family. He just created a new... Notice that what Jesus gives, He gives reasonable things in our minds. Notice Jesus didn't say, one of them said, I'm tired. Jesus in that parable didn't give people given reasons that seemed sluggish and ridiculous. Ben Franklin was famous for saying, and I always mix up, I don't know why I do this, why this. I can't remember. It doesn't matter. The point will be made either way. But he either said hammer or ladder, and I don't remember. But he tells, neighbor comes over and he says, can I borrow your hammer or can I borrow your ladder? Okay, pick one. And he says, no. And the guy said, why? And he said, because I'm having soup for supper. Now, what's the follow-up, obviously? What does that have to do with... So he said, the guy asked, well, what does that have to do with borrowing your hammer? And he said, nothing, but if I don't want to lend you my hammer, any excuse is as good as another. So, this is... Notice Jesus doesn't give just... He gives reasonable, understandable stuff in our mode of thinking. But they stay in Acts 8, the close of verse 1. First phrase, or last phrase of verse 1. Except the apostles. They stay. Because this is what it takes. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. So we've got Stephen going out, and there's evidence of don't cross us. And we've got Saul ravaging, some translations, ravaging the church. So this meek young fella that they, not so much, right? Now, not so much 2 verses later. They just put their coats there, and you can't blame him. I mean, it's mob rule if he tries to get involved. No, that's not what's happening. Because 2 or 3 verses later, he's making havoc, verse 3. I think some translations say ravaging, entering every house, dragging off men and women. Dragging off. That's not, would you come with me, please, sir? That's violent. That's violent, right? Verse 4, we get the same picture. Therefore, those who were scattered. Okay. Those who were scattered. 9 out of 10 doctors agree, right? I don't blame you. And I wouldn't blame you if you were cowering over here, protecting your family. Those who were scattered did what? They go about preaching the Word. By the way, close of verse 4. Does anybody have a term other than preaching the Word at the close of verse 4? Okay. Why is that what they're doing? It's not trying to stamp down, hey, it's just a misunderstanding. I think you all miss who we are. We're not a threat. The gospel we believe and want to teach is one of peace, and is one of do good to your fellow man, and is one of, you don't get this picture at the close of verse 4. You don't get the picture of they went about cowering. No cowardice, there's courage. The other picture you don't get is that they've got time to sort of ease people into it. You know, if you want to be, if you want someone to lower their guard against you, if you want people to be more accepting, if you want people, what's the idea? You know the frog in the water thing. Then it's. I'm eventually trying to teach you the gospel, Mr. Steve. But what does this passage say? They went about doing what? Easing into it? Or preaching the word? This is a picture I need to get and keep. I need to hold. I've got a friend, many of you will know who I'm talking about. There's a guy I can kind of compare him to up here that many of you would also know who I'm talking about. I've got a friend, preacher buddy of mine, Dale Jenkins, whose dad, Jerry, was the 40-year preaching minister for one congregation in Birmingham. And started out as Central, and then it moved into, I forget, Roebuck Parkway. And now don't look, if you're looking for Roebuck Parkway now, you're not going to find it. They have bought new property and moved. And so they're not on Roebuck Parkway, so they've changed the name. But anyway, 40 years. And people have said, I loved Mr. Jerry. Jenkins was a classmate of my dad's at Lipscomb. And I didn't know Mr. Jerry well, but I knew him. And I knew him fairly well. And loved Mr. Jerry, since passed away. But some would have said that Jerry's greatest strength was outside. A wonderful preacher, but his greatest strength was outside of the pulpit than in it, as a personal worker. And the stories that I know of him are of, he made this little blue book, and he would just have those in his car, and he'd just go into a restaurant and sit, and everybody that walked by, he would, how many can I teach today? How many can I ask if we could have a conversation about this today? And how good he was at that. What those type of men understand is, I don't have time to do something else. I got to do this. This is what I have to do. And so that's what you see in verse 4. Then Philip, verse 5, went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them. All right, Philip's in this. Then Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them. And the multitudes with one accord heeded the things spoken by Philip, hearing and seeing the miracles which he did. Now wait a minute. Verse 6. Hearing, but also seeing the miracles which he did. Why was he doing that? Why was he able to do that? I don't mean what enables him. That's the Holy Spirit enabling that in him, which God gave to the apostles. But for what reason? For what purpose? Remember when the Gospel of John, toward the close of it, says, many other signs and wonders did Jesus in the presence of many witnesses, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe, and what? And believing, these are written that you might believe, and believing you might have life in His name. Signs and wonders were for a purpose of bringing somebody to a message. That's my point. A sign and a wonder that doesn't bring somebody to a message is not the intention God had. The signs and the wonders were not for them to be caught up in the sign and the wonder, but to have an opportunity to hear a message, because they're more likely to listen when you've got their attention. So the purposes of signs and wonders in the apostles, which had to be walking New Testaments, because there was no such thing. They had to be walking, talking New Testaments, so to speak. So Philip, able to do this, is preaching and performing miracles. Verse 7, "For unclean spirits, crying with a loud voice, came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed and lame were healed. And there was great joy in that city." I know you want to answer with a yes, and I know it would be a genuine yes in this room. But for a point's sake, what you see in verse 7, do you have trouble believing that? Now, I don't think anybody in this room does. But the point is, why would I? Why should I? It's not a trick question. I'm not coming at a different angle. I'm just making a separate point for the church. We should make bold claims, because I've already arrived at other beliefs which make those things easier. I don't mean I'm going to believe this so I can believe that. I'm saying since I believe that, I should have no trouble believing this. Once I arrive at a belief in a God who can create a universe and hold it in check, why in the world would I have trouble believing He can fill in the blank? That's being logical in faith. So this is happening. People are seeing, by the way, people are seeing and people are responding, and all of this is written as a matter of history in the first century church, not just in a matter of the text. All of this is written as a matter of history. Okay? Now, does the church do what it did? Does it become what it became by people responding to a hoax? How does the church not just survive, but grow or thrive? How does the church not just survive in the face of threats and being scattered, but thrive for magic, for a magic act? See, that ought to embolden my faith. What happened historically in the church, if this is not happening, we don't get what we get in the growth of the church, because it becomes found out. It becomes viewed as he's hiding it somewhere, like a magician. But that's not what's happening. It's not what happens in the next chapters. It's not what happens throughout the history of the early church. And we're still going. Do people go to their death for hoaxes? Not usually. Not likely. So this is happening. And it's an important episode because, verse 8, "And there was great joy in that city." There ought to be great conviction in this city, in this church, in this room, in this very moment. Because that's true. And it's true, we can say, because people don't do what they did for something phony. I think I've mentioned this before. I don't know where. I know I've mentioned it too many times to count in too many places. I mean, at Crieve Hall, and I've forgotten some of the details. Mom can jump in and fill in wherever. If I get something wrong, she can jump in, or she can poke Jana. Tell him, Dad. In his I always forget whether it was his master's thesis time or his doctoral dissertation time. He was going to write on a phenomenon everybody in the country in the 60s was caught up with Oral Roberts. And Dad doing a study on communication and public perception on something or other was utilizing this that was coming to town. Do you remember if that was in Philadelphia or Columbus? I knew she'd know. She was there. In Columbus, Ohio, during his dissertation. And so he was coming and giving a big, revival, and he was coming and doing what he does. And Dad's kind of there, and he's trying to figure out where he's supposed to go and what he's supposed to do. And he goes to the wrong place, but he's looking for, and he goes to this tent. And what are they doing there? They're basically telling you, here's what's going to happen. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how you're going to fall. Whatever. They're practicing. I'm like, Dad, you could have man, we could have been so wealthy. You missed an opportunity. That's not what happened. That's not what's happening right here. Okay? That ought to matter. Great joy in that city should be great conviction ever since. Now, I want to skip down for the sake of time because of where I want to be next week. In verses 9 through 13, unless there's something that you want to deal with in verses 9 through 13, I'll pause just a moment. And if so, verses 9 through 25, verses 9 through 25, unless there's something you want to deal with right there, and we will do our best to deal with it. But otherwise, I'd like to skip down to another episode in verse 26. Don?
If you look through these verses, look at these names, then you were talking about crazy things that I've heard over, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know if this is exactly right. In order to fight sin, in order to commit wrong, all it takes is for a few good men to not sin. And that's what's happening here. And you mentioned earlier about individuals who just want to step up and start talking. So that you can hear you preach God's word. I think of Benny Lecter, and I think of Paul Gerber. They can do that, just like that, in situations like that. And earlier, I was sitting there thinking, what is it that the church fights every day? Sin. What is it that every member of the church fights every day? Sin. And so all it takes is a few good people not to sin. And that's what these apostles did. That's what Stephen did. What Philip did. That's what John did here. All they did, they stepped up and started.
Did anybody reject them? Of course. But not everybody. Now, did some of them, is it possible some of these people that stepped up never saw the acceptance of the gospel by somebody that I planted? What? Apollos watered and God gave the increase. Okay, so it could be weeks, months, or years. But somebody is at the top of the hill. If I'm at the top of the hill and some object, what's... But that doesn't think that stone doesn't, that boulder, whatever, doesn't just decide, wake up. That stone doesn't just wake up one morning and decide it's going to start rolling down the hill. There's got to be a force. They are the force. So this is how it happens. So if we can, then we'll go down to verse 26. Going once, going twice. All right. So going down to verse 26, we hit another crucial episode in the early church. Now an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, Arise and go toward the south along the road which goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is desert. Trust me, it is. Okay. Was and is. So he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority, under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who had charge of all her treasury, and had come to Jerusalem to worship, was returning. And sitting in his chariot, he was reading Isaiah the prophet. Then the Spirit said to Philip, Go near and overtake this chariot. So Philip ran to him and heard him, reading the prophet Isaiah, and said, Do you understand what you are reading? And he said, How can I unless someone guides me? And he asked Philip to come up and sit with him. And the place in the scripture which he read was this. Again, Isaiah. He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. In his humiliation, his justice was taken away, and who will declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. Now, there's more coming in verse 34, but we'll pause right there for time. Okay. Why does the Spirit of the Lord, the angel, through the angel of the Lord, why does he speak to Philip and say, This is where I want you to go? Why? Let's start with that. Oh, let me pause. Time out. I should start with one other thing. In 2010, I was sitting in my parents' living room at the old home place. And Dad and I were having a conversation, and I was a mess. This has been 11 years, obviously. Slightly over 11 because it was May of that year. And I was in a real internal, just don't know what to do situation. I was happy where I was in both workplaces, World Christian Broadcasting, Center Chapel congregation, but I had an offer to go to the Kingwood congregation in Murfreesboro as their preaching minister, and another congregation in Columbia, Graymere, had said, "Hey, how about talking to us about this?" And so it's kind of like a menu I don't do well if the menu's too big because I just confuse myself, It's only two other things, but and so, okay, I kind of like this and like that, and I'm just really struggling with pulling the trigger on something or not, or at least pulling that trigger. And I made a statement to Dad, and he hadn't said much up to that point. He was just listening. And he said, Do you believe? And he asked me, and I said, Yeah, oh yeah. And he said, Do you believe? And I said, Yeah. Those are two good things, but you're missing the third. He said, you're going to have to believe that somebody besides you is involved in this equation. And we wasn't talking about an eldership over here or over there. He was talking about the Lord. Because my fear was, well, what if I say no here and say no here, and then nothing else that I'm kind of really excited about comes anymore? Because now how old was I 11 years ago? 44. I'm 44. You know, that magic age. If you're not going to believe that there's somebody else involved in this equation than just you and them, not just in these considerations, but moving forward, you need to stop doing what you're doing. That's what he said. Why do we get what we get in verse 26? Because there's somebody involved. There's somebody involved. I want you to go. Listen, I believe in the providence of God, okay? We sing about the providence of God. The mighty God, omniscient one, His ways we cannot trace. He reckons every good begun and crowns them with His grace. He's here and there and everywhere in all the ways I've tried. I've never passed beyond the sphere of the providence of God. That's verse 1. Know that song? I believe in the providence of God. Now look, what I don't do is go from here to here. You know, the car that can go, that fast-talking guy, by the way, again, this car goes from 0 to 60 in 2.2 seconds or whatever I'm not going from 0 to 60, and what I mean by that is this. I believe in the providence of God. That does not mean everything is providence. Okay? Just because God is providential does not mean everything is providential. But would I dare think that every chance meeting that leads someone to becoming a Christian was happenstance? I'm not saying that either. This one wasn't. This one wasn't. This is not a chance meeting. Verse 26. Now the angel of the Lord, because somebody else is involved, arise, you're going to go here. Here's where it is. Look at verse 27. So he arose and went. Who's that sound like? Abraham. For he went out not knowing where he was going. Now, somebody says, well, that's not the case here. He knows where he's going. He told him where to go, told him where it was, that kind of thing. But the where in another way, how's this going to go? How's this going to go? What am I doing? And I'm assuming that naturally, human nature, he could have had some of the same feelings or fears that Moses could have had. What if they won't hear me? What if I'm not eloquent? Whatever.
I was thinking, the past 20 years that I was an elder, and Chris can contest this too, I think the biggest thing that eldership face is the phrase of let go and let God. People just, I guess they want to have more control. They don't feel that God can give them that control. And that is a tough thing for humans to give up, is control. And in the past 20 years, that's one of the things that I've noticed when talking to individuals and listening to others is that I've got to have more control than what I want God to have control.
I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because I fear I would just be indicting my entire sex. Do you have to drive? Do you ride just fine? Do you ride just fine with somebody else driving as you do driving? If that may be, maybe you do. You're a person I cannot understand. I mean, now, I don't always drive, but I usually drive. I just, to a degree, that just kind of started that way, right? You know, it's a go around, open the door for your date. She gets in, you go around, you cover that kind of thing, and from that point on, it starts that you're driving. But control. I got to drive. I got to drive because I know me. I don't know that person on the road, but I know me. And we drive. I got to drive spiritually. I got to drive. I got to drive. That's what Dad was telling me. You don't have to drive. So he's involved. The providence of God, the Spirit of God, involved in what we see in verse 26 and verse 27. So he arose and went. That's all there was to it. Because this is what God asked him to do. That's all. There's a lesson there at the first phrase of verse 27. So he arose and went. Oh, I didn't notice what time it was. All right, we'll have to pick up here next week because that's that. So we'll pick up here next week.